What up, martial arts people? Today we're reacting to disturbing costs of fighting, and if you wonder why I'm speaking so quietly, because it's in the middle of the night of a Saturday evening, my girlfriend is already sleeping next to that door, and if I'm gonna wake her up now, I think I'm gonna have a bigger problem than those guys here in this documentary, so shh. Let's go.
There is a scab that remains unpicked at the heart of this sport, one that seals in the dark realities of brain damage as a consequence of MMA.
Mixed martial arts fighter Joel Carvalho, he died in hospital after suffering a traumatic brain injury during a cage fight in Dublin, Ireland.
Conor McGregor would tweet out announcing his retirement after realizing he trained the man who dealt the damage responsible for this young fighter passing away.
But I'm always challenged about the brutality.
When you see somebody hits the ground and you think, wow, that's very vicious because they're following them down. What happens is you get a concussive punch to the face, you go down, you take one more, they stop
Patrick Day, who suffered a 10th round knockout loss on Saturday night, died from brain injuries on Wednesday.
Ignorance as to it, because, I didn't have no one. My dad wasn't around like that.
He did not sound the same to me, and I think trying to argue that he was when you can go and look up old interviews he did.
After I saw that interview with you, I was kind of concerned. There's CTE damage here. What's going on?
A question that plagues me every time I tune into a UFC event. Am I somehow partisan to the process that ultimately leaves champions stricken to fumble into their graves? Do fighters toil with that unbearable reality nightly? What do the families left behind think? Well, join me and some special guests along the way as we unravel this fear, a fear of CTE.
Are you ever worried about the long-term effects of taking repetitive punches to the head? You spoke on a little bit before, but...
So no, I don't worry about that. I don't want to live forever anyways.
A disease that strangles his brain cells, causing memory loss, speech problems, and explosive behavior.
Mental disability is a huge thing. It's got me crippled.
I don't want to support an endeavor where people are hurting each other, period.
I think, first of all, they're right, and you are doing something that's definitely going to harm you. However, I feel like if you want to do something that you enjoy doing, that's going to take some time out of your life that's finite anyway, who the fuck am I to tell you can't do that?
Right.
Anybody who's ever done this younger,
That what Joe Rogan just said is also applicable for bodybuilding, because well, here you don't see it as clearly, but the people who are into bodybuilding, especially the pros, well, they're all enhanced, and you see their drug abuse, their steroid abuse, because they're carrying their big round muscles with them. So there it is obvious. Here, in the sport of mixed martial arts, it's not that obvious, because the fighters don't carry their abuse with them every day, except for injuries, but injuries can heal. So, and if you wonder what I'm eating here, it's a cake that my girlfriend made for me. It's a homemade, high protein cake with no sugars, some flour, some protein powder, some good berries. So,
myself included,
all good.
Is dealing with brain issues.
Wars fought in...
By the way, Jack Dempsey, Championship Fighting, I think it's the book called. Get you a copy of that. Get yourself a copy of that book and read it. Man, that's so good. Really, I have it in my shelf here. It's really an awesome book.
inside the ring were vicariously elevating the population through boxers who were showing that grit, toughness and heart are the deciding factor in conquering our hopes and dreams. All you must do is look inside the living room of an average American household in the late 70s and you'd see Sylvester Stallone reminding us to get back up and take life by the horns at our lowest moments. Reduced to its base, boxing is hope. But that didn't stop award-winning author Tris Dixon stating in his 2021 book, Damage, that boxing was Russian roulette with gloves. All the glamour, wealth and fame ultimately cannot shield boxers from the cumulative damage of punch after punch, knockout after knockout, each a click on a revolver, and as the chamber empties, the chances of having a metaphorical bullet lodged into the cranium increases. The sad fact, a quick death would be much better than a terrible reality. What follows in this next segment is a detailed descent into hell for two boxing rivals, and it's not for the faint of heart. You've been warned. Before we get to the UFC and CTE, this story starts at the opening decade of the 20th century, with a Danish-born American boxer, the durable Dane, battling Nelson. He was revered for his toughness and heart in fights, none so more than his infamous bout in 1902. Arkansas set the stage for a war with Christy Williams. After 17 rounds, the pair had managed to notch 51 knockdowns between them. It's a staggering number of falls to the canvas, and paints a picture of a time when boxing was far more brutal than the bouts of today. Despite this back and forth, it was ultimately Williams who would falter, leaving Nelson with his hand raised, celebrating as he squinted through slits.
Sorry, I'm still with the 17 rounds. Man, I can barely fight 3 rounds full contact in late time style. But 17 rounds, man. That man must have a lung volume and an endurance that's crazy.
Where eyes used to be. This battle, however, was a footnote in a plethora of others. A plaque in a dusty and faded old mining town in Goldfield, Nevada, memorializes the spot where an epic, long and grueling slugfest took place between Nelson and Joe Gans. The suffocating heat of the Nevada sun beat down on the two as they pummeled each other in a violent display of grit. The fight was scheduled for 45 rounds.
In round 17, battling Nelson with his back to the camera is coming on strong. Champion Gans in the slightly lighter trunks as his hands full with the powerhouse Nelson.
And by round 17, Gans was quite literally poking his head through the ropes and vomiting onto the floor. Nelson had been laid onto the canvas twice, both in rounds 8 and 15. Battered, bruised, and a face beaten into a pulp. He would cling on.
Sorry, I have to interrupt again. The people who are young like me, they love fighting. They love fighting, and this is what they want to do. They want to beat the shit out of other guys and want to mess around with them and see who's the better one, who is the better martial artist, who's the better fighter, because I think that's something that is in, like, men, that they want to fight, or in most men. And it's not a bad thing if you don't have it. I mean, it's also something that you can train for, this aggressiveness, this power, this will to destroy. And I don't have it necessarily for myself, but I would always say, man, is it that 2-3 minutes of fame in the ring then, and those 2 to 5 years maybe after, is it worth this kind of risk or this kind of injury risk that is involved with the sport of fighting? I mean, 17 rounds, he had his head in the ropes, vomiting. You can't tell me that there was no damage caused. I mean, think about it. Think about it when you're getting into martial arts, and especially when you want to get into full contact fighting. Really think about the risk that is involved. And don't start too early with fighting. I did it. I started too early with fighting, and I torn my biceps here on my shoulder for 3/4 of years. I couldn't do one damn single push-up because I had so much pain in here. Really think about this and get proper training. Do strength training, do cardio, do resistance training, do your sparring, your drills. Listen to your instructor. Most of the coaches and trainers know you better than you think you do, because they see you from the outside when you are training. And usually men like to overestimate their abilities.
To his nickname of Durable with vehement determinism, and would go on to drag Garns into the 42nd round.
Hands all over Nelson as the referee keeps a close eye on the action. An explosive right, and Nelson almost goes down.
An attempt to drown him with sheer heart and willpower. He would land a devastating body shot that crumpled the already stumbling Garns, but unfortunately, it was on the blind side of the ref who determined it to be a low blow and declared Garns the victor, much to the objection of the crowd. Nelson, broken in heart and body, would practically drag himself back to the locker room, intent on revenge. Fast forward 2 years, and 2 more fights between the two. 80 rounds of brutal and violent competition had been waged, with Nelson claiming the trilogy. 1909 would see Nelson lose to the Michigan Wildcat Ad Wolgast, who was tearing through the lightweight division on his path to becoming champion. He was sharp, fast and powerful. In their rematch a year later, 18,000 people would watch a savage competition which would end just after 40 barbaric rounds. Pulitzer Prize journalist, who was the ringside reporter for the fight, would reflect on the competition, saying, "Nelson took punch after punch in the face and ribs until he looked like a great chunk of round steak down as far as the belt." He described Wolgast's onslaught as almost like a child pushing his fist into moist mud pie. Another great journalist, 00 McGreehan, wrote, "For concentrated viciousness, it was the most savage bout I have ever seen." Needless to say, Nelson was pummeled and wrecked by Wolgast's superior fighting ability. Many wanted to see Nelson retire after the Wolgast fight, but blind to the damage he was taking and arrogantly resolved to see his career through to the bitter end, he would have 52 more fights, 52 more savage wars. He would state, "You just can't quit. That's all." Nelson would find himself living till 71, but living would be putting it kindly. His final years were spent in a ruthless decline, seconded to a state hospital in Illinois, as a judge had determined he was without his faculties. And whilst his death was officially listed as senility, the fact was, the Dane was a fragile, decaying vessel of what once was one of the best fighters on the planet. Incontinent, without his memory, and shaking, Battling Nelson died alone and broke.
Oh man, that's
Ad
so
Wolgast,
sad.
the man who he
Shit.
had shared 60 rounds with and who had beaten Nelson to a pulp, wasn't so lucky either. By the end of his Hall of Fame earning career, Wolgast had been the lightweight world champion and defended it multiple times. He had also squandered a hearty prize-fighting fortune and ruined multiple relationships with his family and wife. In 1917, after the First World War had been and gone, he was declared mentally incompetent, having guardianship placed over him by his old manager. Continuing to shadowbox and train, asking every day when he would be allowed to spar again, but his manager would never allow a glove to touch his fragile friend again. A revolving door of legendary boxers would come through the gym to see the revered Wolgast. Tris Dixon writes, "They patted him on the back and told him he was the best, but he viewed the world through blank, bleak eyes that could only stare into the distance of a hazy rear-view mirror." The grim picture that Tris paints, unfortunately, isn't hyperbole. Wolgast would be institutionalized in a stingy and dark state hospital to live out the rest of his years. You'd assume in safety. However, at the age of 61, he would receive the beating of his lifetime at the hand of 2 wardens. It was so severe that he would be left blind. Now, even frailer, grey, and confined to a wheelchair, Wolgast would drone around incoherent and rambling. It was a situation that was painfully described by famed The Ring editor, Nat Fleischer. Out in California, there sits a pathetic figure in a state mental institution, awaiting the call of his heavenly father. Helpless, extremely ill, and his mind all shattered. Ad Wolgast, the lightweight who had made headlines during the period between 1906 and 1916, the days when the world's greatest lightweights were performing, has again hit the extraordinary. But as a nationally famous personality whose days on this earth are numbered, he had reached a point where he was broken in everything but spirit, a victim of the ring game and all its trappings, doomed to semi-individualism for the remainder of his days. In the final years, he truly believed that he would be returning to the ring for one more final bout, to get the championship belt, to beat Battling Nelson one more time. One of his physicians would state pitifully, "We can't do anything for him. His mind has lost its grip on all elements of time. Too much battering around the head. Alone, broken, his mind ground to dust." Wolgast would die at 67. Described as hopelessly insane. Battling Nelson and Ad Wolgast, 2 competitors who broke each other in the ring over the course of 60 hard-fought rounds, died without knowledge of their fights ever taking place. This harrowing story was simply a standard tale at the time for boxers, and it left the world of science to figure out what was going on and why were boxers ending up broken and discarded into institutions. In 1928, pathologist Dr. Harrison Stanford Martland would publish a paper entitled Punch Drunk, which focused on observation the doctor had made on boxers during the time. He noted that those who were taking a beating to make a living would be suffering with tremors, slowed movement, confusion, and speech problems. Being punch drunk was often a slur that would be forwarded to veterans of the sport, whose stumbling and mumbling would appear drunk. The reality was much worse. However, the political landscape of the country had more pressing matters to attend to than finding out what was wrong with some boxers punch drunk and rotting on the street. Prohibition, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression took precedent, whilst the husks of champion boxers faded to dust on the sidewalks and in institutions. The competitors of the sport were either complicit in the degradation of their own brains, willfully putting aside stories of punch-drunk fighters for a chance at legacy, or they were just simply unaware of the potential damage that they were accumulating. Despite political distractions, medical practitioners were still attempting to put legitimacy on the syndrome with painstaking research and analysis of dead fighters' brains. The warning signs were there, but it didn't stop boxers climbing under the ropes and into the ring, exposing themselves to damage no human body was built to withstand. In 1949, British neurologist MacDonald Critchley published a study titled Punch-Drunk Syndrome, Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy of Boxers. It was an attempt at moving away from the somewhat inappropriately named punch-drunk syndrome and into something more professional sounding, and perhaps a title to be taken more seriously. So, CTE was born. But what exactly is it? CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
After taking head trauma, which is a punch so powerful it's
equal to getting hit by a Ford Escort going fast as it can.
Nerve cells become damaged. From this, a protein called tau is released. The more punches to the head, the more tau. This can then become tangled up together into clumps. When enough of it is present.
Did you know what CTE is? I have heard the term before, but I never went like this detailed into it, so that's very interesting to see.
It begins to kill brain cells. The brain quite literally shrinks and decays smaller and smaller every second. What comes next? Suicidal thoughts, depression, slurred speech, and dementia. Despite this groundbreaking study, there was still no movement, no progress. Boxers were left to rot.
It wasn't until Dr. Benet Omalu, almost half a decade later in the early 2000s, who would bring the illness to the forefront again. But this time, it wasn't boxers that he was concerned with.
Oh, rugby. Yeah. I didn't follow rugby,
You're
yeah.
about to meet
Sure.
the real-life doctor who discovered that insidious disease found in the brains of athletes who suffered repeated blows to the head.
Benet worked with former Hall of Fame NFL player Mike Webster, who after retirement would go through a series of worsening symptoms, all too familiar of the boxers from the early 20th century. Mood swings, depressions, thoughts, and eventually dementia.
Things we do to one another, okay? Hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just tired and confused right now.
His brain was donated for research after his death, and this is where Benet would lead groundbreaking research that diagnosed Webster as the first NFL player with CTE, with a clear link between concussions, head hits, and physical and mental decline, which was explained by damaged brains in the presence of tau. It was hard for anyone to argue that American football didn't need to change. What followed was resistance and denial, but as the months passed by, players were lining the field and exposing themselves to repeated blows to the head. But eventually the science would relent, and with it a slew of changes has made the sport safer, more regulated, and forced the development of better protection. The problem with boxing and MMA, however, there are no leagues or centralized organizations responsible for all participants of the sport. So what transpires is no one taking the onus to rein fighters in, protect them, and warn them of the damage, what the science says. It was completely shocking to me when making this video how often I heard fighters saying the science isn't exactly clear on the subject. Whilst there might be some truth to that, what they're talking about is what exactly is happening, not what the end result is. That isn't disputed. and the end result is complete and utter devastation. Invariably, extreme sports carry with it the risk of death, perhaps worse still, a slow and terrible descent into the grave. And it for me raises the question, why do these athletes, particularly those in combat sports, take the risk? What is so intoxicating about competition in the ring that blinds them to this unbearable reality? Would they take the risk if they fully understood the ramifications of their actions? CTE goes hand in hand with dementia, so would they compete if they knew what it truly felt like to slowly forget everything they ever were? Before we answer that question though, it's important to remember the lived experience of those boxers who fell apart in the 20th century after a career of slugging it out in the ring. It's a terrible existence, and so this next segment I toiled with taking out for a long time, as it paints the picture of what living with CTE actually looks like and feels like. It might be hard to watch for some viewers, and so it is skippable using the timestamp down below. But what?
Okay, so if you have a problem with this, then please skip away. If not, then let's go through this
What
together.
follows is a 3-minute segment on dementia. After that, we turn to the UFC's and MMA's relationship with CTE. The Father isn't a horror movie in the conventional sense, nor would I think the director, producer, and actors consider it to be one. Firstly, there are no known tropes of a horror movie. There's no jump scares, no ghouls, no ghosts, no demons dredged up from the underworld. There is only the abject terror of an illness that quite literally takes everything you ever thought or did and slowly, effectively erases it. And this all cruelly executed in a confusing, disorientating scramble of false memories muddied with real glimpses into the veil of a life that shortly will never have existed.
What's going to become of me?
The Father follows Anthony, an elderly gentleman who is slowly being crushed by the callous grip of dementia. We see his life played out from his fragmented perspective, and it's a movie that can more accurately be described as an experience. Everything from the composition of shots, sets, and the script itself, all purposely disjointed in the most unsettling sense. As the story plays out in its non-linear model of splintered scenes, there is a tangible degradation in Anthony's narrative. Scenes become increasingly cyclical and confusing. Actors flow in and out, and the audience loses track of what was, what is, and what never happened.
What is this nonsense?
The nature of uncertainty slices through the screen, and those fleeting moments of happiness, humor, and understanding become even more traumatic as we, along with Anne, Anthony's daughter, are acutely aware of their transient nature. This clarity and happiness will soon give way to further unreliability.
I'm not leaving my flat! This isn't your flat, Anthony.
You're living with your daughter at the moment, is that right?
Yes, until she goes to live in Paris. It's my flat, isn't it?
And so the cycle continues, relentlessly and ceaselessly downward. Shots increasingly portray his home as a labyrinth, a prison that shifts and swaps in a perplexing charade. This is the lived experience of those suffering with dementia. This is true terror, but what is perhaps just as haunting about Anthony's unraveling is the emptiness and loss that is felt by those around him. This illness doesn't just destroy what is inside the mind, but everything else around it. It leaves a family trying desperately to hold on to any semblance of what was, an eager attempt to cling on to a person who is slowly losing themselves to nothingness. The most interesting thing to me, however, is society's consistent attempt to try and understand and frame dementia or Alzheimer's in a way that is relatable, digestible even to those on the fringe of this illness. It's as if we have some morbid curiosity, some desire to put ourselves as close to it as possible, without being brushed by its deathly touch. The Father sits amongst many collections of art that attempt to piece together the fragments of neurological degenerative diseases. William Utemolen, whose diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease compelled him to begin a series of self-portraits as he advanced through his ailment. What we see is a slow and haunting decline as William blurs the line between what.
So just a quick side note here. So my girlfriend is actually working with people who have Alzheimer and dementia in the elderly home, and sometimes she tells me about the people she's working with, but the hospital or the elderly home that she's working is not actually a place for people with dementia. So they're having big problems there, and I don't understand why there's no place in Switzerland for those people. There seems to be no place for them. Maybe there's not enough places. That's maybe also a thing. But what she tells me sometimes that the people are, it's like in horror movies, man. they're walking in the night outside and speaking with themselves. Like it's basically with a horror movie. And she's telling me that by the side, and I think for myself, man, how can you do this job, man? I have so much of respect for those people who work this job. And also for my girlfriend, that she's doing something like this, because it's not that good paid as it should be. God damn it. Why not? I don't get why not. She deserves so much more money for what she does, because she's basically like, the last 10 years are the worst for those people, because they forget everything. Their kids don't visit them so often, so they have a lot of time alone, and they're starting to forget things, basic things. How to eat, how to speak, how to tie their shoes. They need help. And if you don't pay somebody for this help, then who's gonna do it for you? Nobody. You're left alone. And I don't want to think about all these people who don't live in a country like Switzerland, Germany. I don't know how about the US or something, but in Europe it's a pretty good healthcare system in most of the countries. Outside of Europe, man, shit, how do you do this? Having a lot of kids and let them take care of you, yes, but I think we should be more advanced on this, right? Okay, enough real talk. Let's go back.
What is an expression of his illness, and what is the actual diminishing of his ability to paint and understand the world around him? As his worsening condition grinds his mind and body down, his art fades with it. His self-portraits become broken, abstract, and unrecognizable. The fact is, whether it's a painting, a movie, we don't need much of a push to empathize with those who suffer. We don't need every detail, every fact. We are often simply surrounded by it. Dementia affects 1 in 14 people over 65. It's a stomach-churning reminder that in our lifetime, we almost certainly will see someone decline into this fragility. It is of course no surprise that in a report from the BBC, a study would find that boxers were twice as likely to be diagnosed with a form of Alzheimer's. Battling Nelson and Ad Wargast were far from alone. It seems reasonable to suggest that soon, as time catches up with MMA fighters, they either will match or surpass that statistic. It's a question.
I mean, do we have? How old is the sport of MMA? If you notice, or can you check it and write it down in the comments? Because we have heard now about the boxers. Boxing is a pretty, so to speak, old martial art, 100 years, maybe a little bit more years old. And the boxers we saw were 1905 to 1916, so on, so in the beginning of the 20th century. But MMA is not that old, and it is much more violent, I would say, as we have seen the footage now, and we also watch UFC and so on, and Bellator MMA and all these events. It seems to be much more violent, at least to me. I don't know how about you, but to me, yes. And I think when now a little bit more time is going on, and the people who did or who were professional MMA fighters are rising to this stage, 50, 60, 70 years, I think then people are going to reconsider if they really want to go this path of life or not. Because now we are like in the start or in the middle of the lifespan, so to speak, I would say, to my knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I know so far.
Question that I feel is slowly being answered.
That's going to be interesting.
It's not looking great.
And his opponent is one heck of a striker. Ferocious. Gary Big Daddy Goodrich, runner-up in UFC 8, losing only to Don the Predator Fry.
He's going to make a mistake. There's a mistake.
Look out, he's in the mount.
That's the old UFC.
Well, let me ask you, did any of those slams when he picked you up and brought you down to the...
I see why guys want to pick up bare knuckle fights, because it's the rawest, most manly thing. To me, sorry, you're just dumb. You're just straight dumb. I mean, if your manliness is so much more important than your health, then maybe, in my opinion, there's something to reconsider. And especially if you then also have a family, then you're just straight up an asshole.
Octagon floor bother you? Did they hurt you?
They actually didn't hurt. What will hurt is maybe tomorrow morning.
The opponent he never saw coming. In 2012, doctors diagnosed him with degenerative dementia, a type of CTE. It's caused by repeated blows to the head.
I truly, honestly believe if it wasn't for the pills that I'm taking, my life would have been done a long time ago.
You would have killed yourself.
Absolutely.
Gary Goodridge, a pioneer of the sport, carries the heavy burden of also being one of the first, most documented fighters to tread solemnly into the void that awaits him as his health slowly declines. His lengthy and vicious career had caught up with him. Depression and dementia now plague his everyday. The saddest part of all, as the clock ticks, more fighters join him every day.
What's your day-to-day life like?
I forget where I'm going. Depression, dizzy spells, calling people different names, not knowing their actual name. My kids, I've had instances in the past that I couldn't think of their name on the spot.
We've heard rumblings of Spencer Fisher. You look at Matt Hughes. You look at fucking Coleman. You look at what happens to all. Go have a conversation with Chuck Liddell. You look at all these old timers, all the guys you grew up loving, watching. None of them are doing well mentally. Fucking none of them.
And perhaps caught in the glory of it all, intoxicated off the.
That's true. Yeah, the people of the UFC 1, 2, 3, 5, and so on, they're getting old now. I think then we see now. This is now the part where we start to see the results of their experience.
Crowds. They were swept unwittingly towards a future that seems so unlikely. The most heartbreaking twist to me is that oftentimes they were only stepping into the octagon to provide for their family. The story is always the same. This, fighting, is the only thing that they were ever good at. That ruthless talent was upheld by the honorable mission to provide for their family. And now, they can't even remember their names.
I just knew it was a do or die, and it kept that in the back of my mind. I have a family to feed, and
sometimes he'll just forget he was supposed to pick me up. Dad forgot a few things today.
My days suck. Probably given a little bit of depression.
The more that time goes on, and the more we get educated on what these guys are putting their bodies and brains through, it's not good.
And as the science grows, it's becoming increasingly more obvious that MMA is by far leading the dance in terms of damage. Just how much damage? Well, I have my friend Napoleon Bonaparte to go over some of the staggering statistics.
If we head on over to Epuipment.com and subsequently offer to buy them a coffee for all their hard work, we're greeted with a breakdown of every fight that has ever taken place in the UFC. Sadly, until I can get my idea for a street fight metric off the ground, there are no statistics for BJ Penn's strip club parking lot brawls, Conor McGregor's pub assaults, or John Jones' police cruiser headbutts. According to Fight Metric, there have been 6,731 fights, and of these, 2,176 have ended by KO, TKO, or doctor stoppage. But that doesn't paint the whole picture. Occasionally, the octagon will play host to a beatdown more one-sided than Israel Adesanya's anime Dreamgirls, yet somehow doesn't end by KO or TKO. One such example is the fight between Max Holloway and Calvin Kattar. Holloway put on a display of dominance so sublime that I expected Bruce Buffer to declare it a perfect. In total, Max landed 445 significant strikes, 274 of which were to the head. Rewind a few fights before that, and in another war, Max would land 244 strikes to the head of Brian Ortega in a fight so brutal that not only did Ortega lose, and lose badly, but in the aftermath, he shaved off his luxurious locks and gave us the cursed bald Ortega look. Max Holloway is delivering CTE and hair loss like they were prime day deals. Over the course of his UFC career, he's dished out over 3,200 significant strikes. So what does the science say about how many punches an average person should take to the head in a lifetime? Unsurprisingly, it's none. At UFC 200, Mark Hunt fought that all-natural, juice-free, jacked white boy, Brock Lesnar. Hunt was on the receiving end of 137 significant strikes. 137 strikes from a man whose hands were so big, the UFC had to invent a new glove just to fit them. In his next fight, Hunt fought Alistair Overeem, a man so ludicrously muscled he looks like the real-world inspiration for Biscuit Oliva from Baggy the Grappler. Overeem knocked him out, and while Hunt would go on to win his next fight against Derek Lewis, he still ate 34 shots to the head from a man famous for his one-punch KO power. Mark Hunt, not deterred by these losses, would release an article entitled "If I Die Fighting," in which he said, "My body is fucked, but my mind is still here. I've still got my senses about me, and I know what's right and wrong, which is the main thing. Sometimes I don't sleep well. You can hear me starting to stutter and slur my words. My memory is not as good anymore. I'll forget something I did yesterday, but I can remember the shit I did years and years ago. That's just the price I've paid. The price of being a fighter. But I've fought a lot of drug cheats and copped a lot of punishment from guys who are cheating, and that's not right. I've been fighting since I was a child, fighting to get out of my circumstances. I used to make $300 a week, struggling to put food on the table, but I've become one of the highest paid fighters in the world. I feel that's destiny. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and if I die fighting, that's fine. I just hope that if it does happen, it will be in an honest and fair competition." The UFC, upon reading this article, would pull Mark Hunt from his next fight, and he was made undergo a series of tests before he could be cleared to fight again. Mark took this as an insult and saw it as the UFC actively trying to take food off his table. Despite slurred speech and memory loss, common symptoms of CTE, he would be allowed to fight again, showing clearly that despite medical advice, fighters can and do lie their way to the ring and compete, such as how Michael Bisping, despite being blinded in one eye after a head kick from a juiced up Vitor Belfort, lied about his vision and cheated on eye exams in order to be cleared to fight. It also shows that the UFC does care when it comes to their fighters, but they can't stop a disgruntled fighter who thinks they know better than to put their body through more wars and is willing to cheat the system in order to do so. Mark Hunt said he wouldn't mind dying in the ring, and I'm sure it's a notion shared among a lot of the fighters of his era, men too tough for their own good, desirous of a glorious Viking death in the octagon, axe in hand, his seat in Valhalla secured, a romanticized Hollywood-style blaze of glory. But the reality is likely to be far more depressing, a drawn-out end, marred by slurred speech, mood swings, memory loss, depression, and ultimately, not being able to remember his own career. The truth is, his brain is already broken. Unbelievably, he would fight 3 more times, losing all 3 fights. He would receive 118 more strikes to a body that had already absorbed more damage than any human should.
Mark Hunt is just one fighter of thousands who are beginning to see symptoms, side effects of lengthy and brutal careers. Max Holloway's 3,200 strikes are a drop in the ocean compared to the millions of strikes landed on MMA fighters year-round. A Canadian research study on traumatic brain injuries, TBI, in sports found that in a third of competitions, fighters were being exposed to a TBI, which is intrinsically linked to the development of CTE. This is literally triple boxing and double what is typical in American football. And whilst it may seem justifiable to fighters who have made millions, reached the top echelon of the sport and had storied careers, it's reasonable to assume for every one of those success stories, there is an amateur who failed to climb the ranks, fighting for a pittance and now broke in more ways than one. Whilst there are improvements to how fighters train and spar, I really question whether the protection of headgear, safer sparring and forced suspensions after knockout losses are enough to shield fighters from the same fate as the durable Dane. Especially when you see fighters like Sean Strickland have his brain sloshed around in his cranium, only to be sparring with a bloody nose 4 days later. There is literally no regulation and no way to enforce these safety protocols. And let's not forget, this is the same fighter who has been seen numerous times knocking out his sparring partners. If there have been over 2,000 stoppages in the UFC, I dread to think what the total is when we take into consideration.
Why does he knock out his sparring partners? I know I'm not a pro, but sparring should, in my opinion, always be almost a friendly environment, a learning environment. Yes, you can have hard sparring, but not as a default setting, not as a default setting you do on a weekly basis, man.
training stories. Justin Gaethje himself has gone on record saying that he takes hard punches because it's good training for the actual fight. I'd like to see the evidence for this, especially when you consider fighters notorious.
There is no evidence for this. You see also, sadly, in a lot of Kung Fu videos, you see people are getting like blows to the head, and also in, I think, Muay Thai videos, you see this, or I've seen this, that the practitioners stand there on the wall like this. They're just getting punched in the face by the instructor, and this is just like, what the fuck? No, that's not how it works.
For having a chin of granite don't even spar at all. The only silver lining, really, is that MMA isn't completely blind to this. Dana White gives millions to research for this exact problem each year. But it's not enough. The research is too slow. And for me, the stories of fighters suffering is mounting, with nothing being done. It's so easy to
But I'm really impressed that Dana White is really spending that much of money. Because most of the time when you see something like this where responsibility comes in because of people are getting hurt or ill or damaged, most of the time big organizations give really a damn crap about this. I mean, look at Nestle, Monsanto, all the big companies, all the big food companies. They're like, just the products, man, the fast food products. I hope I find some documentaries about this also from an English standpoint. I know there's RT France, which is putting out extremely well produced documentaries on food. And maybe if you know something, comment down below, please. I want to watch this and also react on this, because it's also a topic that really is from the bottom of my heart I want to spread. But coming back to my point I wanted to make, when usually the big companies don't take responsibility for this because they're searching some other solution or a way to sneak out and just leave the poor people, the plebs, for themselves, so to speak. Surprising that Dana White is not like this, which makes me actually a little bit proud. I'm not an MMA practitioner. I like watching MMA, UFC and so on, but martial arts, man,
understand,
cool
though, the fight game is
Mostly.
intoxicating, suffocating, and its call is a siren song for any fight fan. We brush these facts aside to see men and women rise to the top in brutal displays of heart and toughness. And as the crowd's roar snuffs out any concern, fighters become deaf to the very real danger that they face. The fans, all this time, oblivious as fighters march headfirst into the heart of darkness.
Seen before. No one has ever knocked out Tony Ferguson.
Okay, time out. It is pretty heavy stuff, and it's stories like these that show the dark side of what this sport has to offer, but I don't want that to be the only perspective that's discussed. I want to show you why people take these risks, but it's not a question that I can answer on my own. So I reached out to a few people who might be able to offer their own opinions, perspective, and experiences on how they feel about this very dichotomy.
So Sam Patterson, fighting for Brave Combat Federation. My record is 9-1-1. I know the damage of what this sport can do and what consequences are, but I know what I'm getting myself into. I chose to fight.
I do, and I just know what I signed up for. I just don't want to, obviously I don't want to be like someone with a glass jaw when I'm like 40 and I'm going to be fighting like for peanuts and I'm still trying to survive, but I'm getting knocked out every fight. I want to achieve great things, and I felt the only thing I know how to achieve great things is fighting. It makes me feel alive. It feels like it's therapy for me, and it's like peace in a way.
If you look at the other professional sports that CTE is mentioned all the time, football, even soccer, out of these sports, the athletes are roided out of their minds. I think that will play a big part in how much CTE plays in the future, is on how clean our sport stays. It's a true danger to our sport, is people that are willing to take that step over the line.
Of course.
Yeah, but sorry, but man, if you look at some UFC fighters, they are clearly roided. They're juiced up as fuck. You see that, and it's starting to get off.
They're going to end up with like brain damage. You're just smashing each other's heads in. I think the game's evolved in the fact that people realize you don't need to do that to get fight fit.
As a coach, I make sure I know what my guys are doing when they're doing it. I don't want them going with people that are just going to beat them up.
I'm just going in there as a competitor to win. And I'm sure they've got the same mindset and they know the same risks that I know doing this sport. It's him. He's trying to do what I'm trying to do to him, you know, like it's him or me kind of thing.
It's kill or be killed in there. So I just feel like if he wants to do the same to me, so I'm gonna do it to him, and I have no hesitation, not one bit of doubt or hesitation in my hands.
Shoot, I've been fighting for 15 or 16 years now. I'm aware of the impact it could have on the rest of my life. And I know it's a young sport, so it's still probably a little premature to say we don't get it that often. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's that it doesn't happen to nearly the rate that people think it does.
All these fighters have warrior mentality, and they all do it for different reasons, whether it be because they just love the sport and this is what they fell in love with, or they're trying to provide for their family and change their future family's lives forever. I think as long as we stop talking about CTE as this like taboo thing that no one really wants to talk about, and we put it out in the open and fighters know what they're getting into, I don't think that there's any reason that any of us should have to say that we can't enjoy the sport, both participating in it and spectating. In a lot of ways, the risk that these guys take on when they step into the ring or step into the cage is the reason that the sport is so beautiful.
So it's 2022, the time when people can pretend they don't understand what the risks are taking a bunch of head trauma. That's over. Everyone knows. Now, they might not really understand. They might understand what the risk is, but they don't really understand for themselves. That's not part of the equation. When someone asks me, why do you create content that supports this sport? Why are you a fan of the sport? What makes you passionate about mixed martial arts as a fan and, as a former, as someone who trains in martial arts? Why is it so important to you? The reason is because of what it represents. It represents a lifelong dedication to a craft, and when you compete in that craft, the stakes cannot be higher. It's about the gravity. It's about the gravity of the events themselves. Every time a person fights, what's actually on the line? Their career is their life. Their life is on the line every time they fight, every single time. And their life is literally on the line. Anyone in the UFC or in the smaller shows that's fighting into their 30s, they have to know that there is a chance they are sacrificing the back half of their life in pursuit of glory in the front half of their life. The ultimate pinnacle of what can be achieved for a person wired like us. The champion of the world in the UFC or the champion of the world in boxing or whatever it is. They're chasing a dream that if anyone who's 13 years old is asked hey, what's your dream? What do you want to be when you grow up? And they say, I want to be champion of the world. 100% of people who hear a person say that dismiss it completely. They go, okay. And so what you're actually looking at when you watch a person participating in this sport is you're watching someone chasing an impossible dream that no one believed except them and maybe a handful of people in their life. And the stakes being so high, the risk of serious injury, the certainty of physical and emotional challenges later in your life for many participants, that's part of it. I am not a person who's going to take away a person's dream and the pursuit of that dream. I won't do it. I will never sign off on it. I don't care what the repercussions are as long as they know what the repercussions are. I would never support taking away their ability to chase an impossible dream. Never. And I completely understand why people feel like that would be a reasonable position to take. Look at Spencer Fisher. Junior Seau shit himself. I mean, maybe this has something to do with head trauma. Who knows, man? Who knows? Guys that parked on the train tracks. The likelihood that that's uninvolved in CTE seems nearly impossible. All of these things, yes, I understand. Jimmy, I've seen the videos of these guys, and yes, it's awful, but that's the risk. That is the risk. And they're choosing to accept that risk in pursuit of something unattainable.
I think I should quit martial arts and start something easy like golfing or football. I mean, there's more money involved.
Only the greatest among us attain. And that's why I love the sport so much. I love it. I love it more than anything. I love it. That's why I dedicate so much time talking about it.
A lot of these fighters know that their lives could be altered for the worst at a moment's notice, but they do it anyway. As someone who's still scared of the dark and still cries at most Disney movies, I'm really in awe of how brave these fighters are to go out and risk it all. And their bravery makes me just feel really honored to be able to watch them put it all on the line and create the best spectator sport in the entire world.
Ultimately, it's not about damage, it's not about risk, it's not about what could be or has been. It's about rising to the top, crawling through the dirt, flying as close to the sun without being scorched.
That might be it for me.
Legacy, dreams, hope, ambition, it doesn't exist without pushing ourselves to the limits. It doesn't exist without failure, without loss, without sacrifice. Being great, being remembered, lining the history books is only achieved by those who are willing to lose it all. That is what MMA is. It's hope.
I will be champion, I promise.
Champion, shop it. I don't have to stop it. You're a champion. You're going to call finish this round on top of the round with precision. Okay? Get on top of it. I'll rest them.
Professor Robert Cantu, who had given his life to research on CTE, believes that it's often the case fighters are fully aware of the dangers inherent in their sport. It's just they simply think it's not going to be themselves who eventually suffer the consequences. Just as we blissfully wander through life thinking we are here to see it through peacefully to the end, the actuality is we are all puppets to the world's will. And whilst the father, or any of the other forms of dementia simulation that we discussed, might be enough to deter or shock a fighter into understanding what truly awaits them beyond the octagon, for me, it isn't quite as evocative as what we are listening to right now. You might be lulled into believing this nostalgic and vintage-sounding song is quite peaceful, but the truth is that it's an auditory nightmare crafted by an artist known as The Caretaker. It's a 6.5-hour sonic hell that answers one simple question. What does dementia sound like? Over the course of its excruciatingly long runtime, Everywhere at the End of Time slowly degrades into what can only be described as a melodic abyss. Each segment of this masterpiece is used to musically depict the 7 stages of dementia, each stage worsening and deteriorating into desolate and solemn swells of bleakness. What you are listening to currently is a shortened version that will be played as I conclude this video with my final thoughts. Pay attention as it slowly and painfully unravels. For me, its musical landscapes bring hauntingly vivid realism to that vacant stare wedged into the eye sockets of boxers and cage fighters, their grizzled faces lined with scar tissue, the physical manifestations of brutal wars waged on coarse canvas that were beheld by an audience of thousands, and that very crowd, bloodthirsty and callously screaming for more, are complicit in supporting a sport which slowly destroys the brains of our most beloved fighters. Perhaps, more truthfully, they, along with the competitors, just choose to ignore the startling facts. I mean, after all, we need an underdog story to root for. We need a champion to rise, and to see the heel fall. Mixed martial arts will march on regardless, and fighters will ultimately fall in and out of favor. Like broken toys, they'll be cast to the wayside once their use has run its course. We aren't monsters for standing to one side, as those braver and more courageous wrap their hands and lace their gloves. Are we? Surely not. Surely not. Surely not.
Change that tomorrow, but before to a good portion.
It's very cool, made from the editing point.
Look like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ah, rumble, young man, rumble. Hey! When I'm gone, boxing is gone. They might still try, but they'll never have another Gates or another Cassius Clay.
When Muhammad Ali was asked whether knowing his eventual state would do it all again, he would proclaim, restricted to his armchair, "You bet." And I suppose that ultimately surmises my perspective. Fighting is an extreme sport, and taking a chance to line the history book with your name by stepping into the ring comes with a very real risk that perhaps you won't ever remember doing it. And if, with full knowledge, you make that fateful dance, then that is yours alone. It is perhaps the deafening silence of commissions, the denial of organizations, and the blind eye of medical practitioners that leave those unaware or uneducated to unwillingly waltz into nothingness. That is to me the most egregious. Those glittering lights, the cheering crowds, and a glimpse of fame are perhaps a snare waiting to trap everything a fighter ever was or will be. Perhaps we are the lucky ones to remember and honor their legacy. Perhaps we are the ones to keep their fire lit and champion what they stood for. That is, surely, our duty as fans.
What would you like people to think about you when you've gone?
I'd like for them to say he took a few cups of love. He took 1 tablespoon of patience, 1 teaspoon of generosity, 1 pint of kindness. He took 1 quart of laughter, 1 pinch of concern, and then he mixed willingness with happiness. He added lots of faith, and he stirred it up well. Then he spread it over a span of a lifetime, and he served it to each and every deserving person he met.
The once glamorous and nostalgic song fizzles out into a broken, melancholic echo of its once former prestige. It's a reminder that this disease festering away doesn't snuff out the candle with one subtle breeze. It slowly wears the wick down in a sad decline, the darkness ever present, just waiting to seep in as the light runs its course. And as the last desperate flicks of flame dance across an ebony canvas, there is a cool and empty silence. Then it's gone, and in that bleak and somber blackness, there remains only a fleeting memory of what was, but has since faded.
Why do I keep my mind from it? Why do I keep your care? We after all I had kept from you in the springtime when
So apparently it seems to be it with the video. So my final thoughts are, maybe if you're just starting out with martial arts, if you're watching this channel then, or if you're already a little bit more advanced, then please think about what you want out of martial arts, because it's not only about what you have seen here. It's not just about full contact fighting. It's also about sparring, drilling applications. You can also do sparring with no head contact, just blows to the body. And you can go a little bit harder, maybe point sparring, drills, forms, speed bag, heavy bag, conditioning. It's really about developing the body. It's not just about knocking out other people. That's what really is important to me, that you get across from this channel and from my work that I do when I talk about martial arts in general, and about Kung Fu, about karate, mixed martial arts, UFC, jiu-jitsu, whatever. And if I have some advice for you, then it is 1, eat more vegetables, 1 fruit and 1 vegetable. For every time you eat something, have a protein source. Next thing, if you do martial arts, you need to do strength training, because exactly for this reason, for injuries, it's the #1 factor. Having muscles that protect your bones, to protect your ligaments and tendons. And also with strength training, you get stronger tendons and ligaments. Your body is rebuilding itself from the inside. That's what we want in martial arts. We want to have a strong body. We have to have a strong mind. Let's also make some thoughts about this. When the only thing in life that you have is fighting, that's, I think it's sad. Because, man, there's so much more to life than just martial arts and fighting. And that's why I go now to bed to my girlfriend and give her a cuddle. So we see us in the next video. If you have watched until now, then please let me know in the comments. Write some hashtags in that I know that you really watched it all the way to the end. And god damn it, yeah, it's 2:30 now. So have a good night. See ya, guys.